Very sad day in baseball with the announcement through the Hall of Fame, through the Seaver family, about Tom retiring from public life. Remember, this is the 50th anniversary of the Mets championship in '69. Mets are going to go do a big deal as far as the celebration is concerned. Art Shamsky's got a book coming out. A lot of it is centered on their Art's trip out to California to visit Tom. He was the linchpin of that great team in '69. Won 25 games to Cy young pitcher. Really represented perfectly the Mets, which the old Yankees at that time in the process of decay. Seaver really was sort of a breath of fresh air for baseball in New York from a National League standpoint. But Tom contacted Lyme disease. It seems like this has triggered this dementia issue, and we're not going to be probably part of that now this summer. Sad day. Tom's 74 years of age. And I'll just do this off the top of my head because this is a picture right in my wheelhouse. 69, I remember some, but I certainly remember those great years with the Mets in the early 70s. And the best way to explain it from what he was and how good he was is I'm not a Met fan. And every time that the Giants, and in those days, the Mets played the Giants plenty of games. Remember, the Giants, playing them, 3 times a year in each park. So these teams came in all the time. I think it was 2 times to the Giants at City or at Shea, and then the Mets going out there. And every time that the Giants were playing the Mets, and the Giants were not great in the early 70s, I said, geez, we're never going to win a game that Seaver pitches. I mean, that's as simple as that. The Mets always had great staffs and were great pitching, but there was nobody better than Tom Seaver. You can take Gibson. I'm going to leave Koufax out. You can take Gibson. You can take Carlton. You can take Jim Palmer. You can take the Dominican dandy, my guy, Marichal. This is the best pitcher, pound for pound, I've ever seen. Pedro in his heyday, we all know how great he was, those games against the Yankees. But this pitcher was a tremendous pitcher. He was a thinking man's pitcher. He had the perfect rotation. He had the perfect delivery. I used to go play stickball, and I used to pretend I was Tom Seaver. And I didn't even like Tom Seaver because he was not one of my guys, 15, 14, 16 years of age. But he was so dominant, never had a lot of run support. Those Mets teams, remember, folks, a lot of folks have always said that the best thing that happened to the Mets was '69, and the worst thing that happened to the Mets was 1973, because the Mets got in a little false sense of security because they won the pennant with 82 wins in '73, and they couldn't hit. They had no offense. They really relied on that great pitching staff. And, that pitching staff went to waste because the Mets, after '69, where they kind of put everything together, a lot of ragamuffin kind of players with Hodges, the platoon system, everything else, everything clicked. They got hot last 2 months. They buried Atlanta and the Orioles. But after that, the Mets kind of stayed with the same formula, and it never worked out. And they caught lightning in the bottle in '73, and they stuck with that formula, and they kind of wasted a lot of these great years with this great staff. Jerry Koosman, Gary Gentry, they made the terrible trade with Nolan Ryan. They got John Matlack in. I mean, they had the great pitching, they just couldn't hit. And Seaver was the guy who embodied that. This guy threw 95 miles an hour, 4 pitches, worked the corners, thinking man's pitcher, and you had a craft and a bat. You had to set up a hitter. I mean, as good as it gets. All right, a little unlucky, the 18 strikeouts, obviously, with the thing with the perfect game with Jimmy Quails' hit. Dave Campbell broke up a big masterpiece one day as far as records are concerned. Didn't throw the no-hitter and went to Cincinnati a little bit later on. But he was just phenomenal. What a pitcher. Loved him. Admired him so much from afar. I mean, listen, he was the best pitcher pound for pound I've ever seen. It's as simple as that. Every year, go look at his baseball card. Black type every single year. Dominated. And, he's a professional. He gave you a tremendous effort on a day-in, day-out basis. And the Mets were lucky to get him because when he left USC, he was drafted by Atlanta and illegally signed, went back into a lottery system with the Indians and the Dodgers, and the Mets picked the ball out of the hat, and they got Tom because of that. So very, very fortunate. He got there in '67, and then he left, of course, in '77, which is a disaster. We set that up with M. Donald Grant, a grouch, whose son-in-law was Dick Young. What a conflict of interest that was. Dick, of course, at the time, a huge columnist in New York who wielded a lot of power. He embarrassed Seaver. Seaver said, I'm out. And the Mets ended up trading him to Cincinnati. And then you had him in Cincinnati, and I've said this 1,000 times, you had Seaver and Johnny Bench. Now, if you are a baseball fan of any note, and in the 70s, and you could think about Tom Seaver pitching to Johnny Bench, I don't know if that's the no-hitter against the Cardinals. I don't know if there's ever been a better battery scenario in the history of the sport. Bench is the best pitcher, best catcher. Seaver, arguably not the best pitcher, but I mean, he's in the top 10, right? I mean, and then you throw Seaver to bench. Nothing got better than that. It was marvelous to watch bench with the one-handed catch scenario, setting up pitches. Seaver with the great windup, 41. Oh, I loved it. Loved it. And I didn't like the Reds because they always beat the Giants at the time in the NL West. And, of course, he came back to the Mets a little bit later on, had some good years. He won his 300th game at Yankee Stadium on Phil Rizzuto Day when he was a member of the White Sox. Remember, Tom pitched for Tony Russo, which is another great story because you're talking about one of the great managers in the history of the sport. In that day, you know, just finding himself, and he's got, obviously, Seaver on his mound. Then he went to Boston and finished up his career. Then he did the games on NBC with the great Dick Enberg. Let's not forget that. Dick and Tom were part of that NBC broadcast crew for a long period of time. And then later, he did Mets games. And then, of course, he did Yankee games with Rizzuto. So he did the whole gamut. He was a very, very good broadcaster, thinking man's broadcaster. What can I tell you? One of the great all-time pitchers you're ever going to see. I remember one time, you know, he used to have issues with my old radio partner and I, Mike Francesa and I, because we used to, you know, whatever we said about the Mets, we picked on Buddy Harrelson, who was Seaver's buddy. So one time, and this is what a competitor he was. So one time we went to go play a softball game up in Greenwich, Connecticut, against, you know, Tom Seaver's all-star softball team up in Greenwich. So the WFAN team went up to Greenwich to play a softball game, and Tom was on the mound. And when I got up, you know, I hit my little ground ball to second base. When I got up, I just saw a little twinkle in his eye that this was not going to be your normal slow pitch softball, bunch of old men kind of at bats. So I dug in with a little bit more I was more tepid than I normally would be. And I kind of looked past, and I said, geez, what's he going to do here? Tom went, the great delivery, threw a fastball under the chin. I think I probably felt like Billy Williams may have felt back in 1973. Tom Seaver, one of the great all-time pitchers, retires from public life. We will talk to Howie Rose about that here momentarily. Boy, what a pitch. And there was a game. What was the game? 70. May 29th. What year? 73. At Candlestick. All right. I remember a game with the old transistor radio in May of 73. Mets played the Giants. They had a lead in the ninth, and the Giants came back and upset Seaver. And the Giants scored 4 in the ninth to win the game 5-2. There was another game at Candlestick. Never forget that game as long as I can live. And I can never forget the game. I'm on this tangent now on Seaver. How about the game that Tom pitched in 73 in Riverfront, game 1 of the NLCS? He had a lead in the ninth, and Rose and I think Bench hit homers off him to beat the Mets 3-2. Matlack won the next day. Mets won the series in 5. Never forget Tom, bottom 9, 73 at Riverfront. I believe Rose and Bench, they may have not been back-to-back, but they hit 2 homers in the ninth to beat them 3-2. That was a shock. So the softball game, Giants coming from behind to beat the Mets. There was another game at Candlestick, and, of course, the game there in Cincinnati. Rose, there you go. Good job. I got the guys right, innings wrong. Rose in the 8th, tied, Bench in the 9th to win. Game 1, 73 NLCS. That was a shock.